We now come to section 3, risk governance. This has 3 subsections: an enterprise view of risk governance, risk tolerance, and risk budgeting. Risk tolerance has to do with how much risk is acceptable for an organization, and risk budgeting has to do with how and where should the risks be taken. An enterprise view of risk governance. First, let's quickly review risk governance. Risk governance is a top-down process that defines risk tolerance and provides guidance to align risk with enterprise goals. It also includes guidance on unacceptable risks and worst losses that can be tolerated. Coming now to enterprise risk management. The key point is that an enterprise risk management perspective deals with the whole organization, and the curriculum illustrates this through an example. It talks about pension fund management. Now, in very simple terms, with pension fund management, we have an asset, which is essentially the pension fund, and this needs to meet pension liabilities. A limited view of risk management would simply consider the assets and try to manage risks so as to maximize the return on these assets. But that would be a mistake, because these assets are meant to meet future liabilities. Now, let's say that we go through an economic downturn. In an economic downturn, chances are that the value of our pension assets will come down. But in a downturn, interest rates come down. If interest rates come down, the liabilities, which often tend to be bond-like, will increase in value. So looking at the pension fund alone without considering the liabilities will be a mistake. Now let's take this one step further. Clearly, this pension plan is for a given company. We need to also understand the business of the company. If the company is in a very cyclic business, then during an economic downturn, it might be difficult for the company to make pension contributions. So picking assets over here that are sensitive to the business cycle would also be a mistake. So when we take an enterprise view, we should consider the liabilities, we should consider the overall business of the organization, and then decide which risks to take. So now these sub-bullets will make sense. We should determine the organization's goals, directions, and priorities, define the risk appetite or risk tolerance. Now, obviously, this will depend on the liabilities that need to be funded and also the overall risk drivers of the organization. The overall objective here is to make decisions that maximize the value of the entire enterprise. Now let's look at a couple of elements of good risk governance. We've talked about the fact that the objectives of risk management are established by the board. Now, it makes sense to have a committee called the Risk Governance Committee, which interprets the objectives and determines how those objectives can be executed. So that can be done through a risk governance committee. This committee can help ensure that the risk framework of an organization stays consistent with the top-level guidance. Its activities could parallel the governance body's risk discussions, but at an operational level as opposed to high-level oversight. Another important element of risk governance is the formal appointment of a responsible executive as the Chief Risk Officer. This officer should be responsible for building and implementing the risk management framework for an organization. Risk tolerance identifies the extent to which the organization is willing to experience losses. Risk tolerance focuses on the appetite for risk. Risk tolerance involves defining which risks are acceptable and which risks are not acceptable. Also, how much risk can the entity be exposed to? The risk tolerance decision begins with two different analyses. Number one, an inside view. What shortfalls within the organization will cause it to fail? And secondly, an outside view. What uncertain forces is the organization exposed to? Now, let's say we have a Spanish construction company and this sells primarily to the US market. If you think about external forces, one key issue facing this company is the dollar euro exchange rate. So, if the
Dollar weakens and euro rises.
then clearly that will be a negative for this company. This is an external factor, and the company needs to figure out how much risk it can take. And if the risk is more than what it can take, then how can that risk be hedged? In terms of internal factors, let's say that the company needs 40 million euro every year for the next 3 years to meet its required capital expenditures. And to get this much amount of money, let's say the company needs to maintain its revenue. If the revenue falls by 10% or more, then not only will the company not be able to meet its cash flow requirements, but certain debt covenants will also be violated, which might cause the company to fail. So this would be an example of challenges within the context of the company. So when this company makes risk tolerance decisions, it needs to consider both the internal context as well as the external context. Now let's look at a few elements that impact how much risk tolerance the company can take. A major one is the ability to respond dynamically to adverse events. If a company has this ability, then it can take on a relatively high level of risk. On the other hand, if a company is not well equipped to deal with adverse events, then the risk tolerance will be low. Other factors that impact the ability to take risk include the competitive landscape and the regulatory environment. There are certain factors that should not impact risk tolerance, and this would include the personal motivations of the management. Now, let's say management is compensated using stock options. It might be in the interest of management to take on excessive risk because that would increase the value of the stock options. But since that's not benefiting the organization, so therefore it will not be appropriate to take on extra risk. Once risk tolerance is determined, the overall risk framework should be geared towards getting the risk exposure in line with the enterprise's risk appetite. Risk budgeting helps determine how or where risks are taken and quantifies tolerable risks by specific metrics. Risk budgeting should drive hedging strategies, not the other way round. Risk budgeting allocates investments or assets by their risk characteristics. Now, here is an example from a portfolio context. We can say that in a given portfolio, 70% of the portfolio is driven by global equity returns, 20% is driven by domestic equity returns, and 10% by interest rates. We can also say that in our portfolio, 45% of the securities are illiquid and 55% of the securities are liquid. So what we've done here is we've allocated our investments or assets along different risk characteristics. So here the main risk driver is global equity returns. Here the driver is domestic equity returns, and so on. A risk budget can involve a simple one-dimensional risk measure, or it can be multi-dimensional, which we will talk about in a few minutes. But here are some of the common measures: standard deviation, beta, value at risk, and scenario loss. We've seen these terms before. Standard deviation is the measure of how asset returns might vary. So we might say this is our portfolio and we might be comfortable with a 15% standard deviation. Beta is a measure of systematic risk. Value at risk talks about how much of this portfolio value is at risk, and it talks in terms of probabilities and time horizons. We'll discuss this later. And then scenario loss would be, in different sorts of scenarios, what is the possible loss. An example would be that we have defined our portfolio and we are saying that the risk is measured using beta and we don't want to take a risk more than market risk. So we can say that the beta is limited to 1. Risk budgeting can also use multiple dimensions of risk. So we can first define the different dimensions of risk. So we can say that there is equity risk, there is fixed income risk, and there is commodity risk. And then we can allocate our investments to these various categories of risk. For each of these categories, we can define or budget the amount of risk that is acceptable. Now, all that needs to fall within the risk tolerance level, but notice here we are deciding where the risk is being taken. We can go one step further and say that within the equity context, we are expecting growth stocks to do well, and let's say growth stocks have a relatively high beta, so we can have a high exposure to growth stocks, and recognizing that we are taking more risk there, which will have to be compensated somewhere else. We can then say that the overall risk of the equity portfolio is capped by a beta of 1.2. So this is a simple illustration of how risk budgeting can use multiple dimensions of risk. A major benefit of the risk budgeting process is that it forces a firm to consider risk trade-offs. So when we are taking extra risk for extra return, we need to do that consciously. If a firm is going after extra returns without recognizing the incremental risk that's being taken, then that would be a mistake. We'll now do example 2, risk governance, and this example has 4 questions. Number 1, which of the following approaches is most consistent with an enterprise view of risk governance? A, separate strategic planning processes for each part of the enterprise. Now remember, enterprise view means that we take a holistic view of the enterprise. If we have a separate planning process for different parts, then that violates the concept that we have developed here. So A is not right. Considering an organization's risk tolerance when developing its asset allocation. So this makes sense. We look at the overall organization's risk tolerance and then develop the asset allocation. So this looks good, but let's also check C. Trying to achieve the highest possible risk-adjusted return on a company's pension fund's assets. Now we talked about this. A pension fund has its assets. These are supposed to meet liabilities. Simply focusing on the assets and trying to have the highest possible risk-adjusted return is not enough. We also need to consider the liabilities and the business environment of the company. 2. Which of the following statements about risk tolerance is most accurate? Risk tolerance is best discussed after a crisis when awareness of risk is heightened. Now, risk tolerance should actually be established before a crisis. So this is not the correct option. The risk tolerance discussion is about the actions management will take to minimize losses. Now, the objective of risk tolerance is not to minimize losses. It's to understand the objectives of an organization and figure out what's the appropriate level of risk tolerance given the objectives of the organization. So this is not true. The organization's risk tolerance describes the extent to which the organization is willing to experience losses. So this is the best of the 3. And I want to emphasize that this is one aspect of the risk tolerance decision. Obviously, there is more to risk tolerance than this single statement. 3. Which of the following is not consistent with a risk budgeting approach to portfolio management? Limiting the beta of a portfolio to 0.75. This is a very simple risk budgeting approach where we have a single metric and we are establishing that the risk is limited to this level. So this is actually consistent and therefore not the right answer since we are looking for not consistent. B. Allocating investments by their amount of underlying risk sources or factors. Now this is also fine. We can have different buckets which are impacted by different risk factors, and we talked about this. One bucket can be which is impacted by global equity risk, then we can have domestic equity risk, we can have fixed income related risks. So option B is consistent with a risk budgeting approach, therefore not the right option. Limiting the amount of money available to spend on hedging strategies by each portfolio manager. Now, this is not consistent because, so this is putting limits without considering risk tolerance. So this is the best answer because we are looking for something that is not consistent with the risk budgeting approach. 4. Who would be the least appropriate for controlling the risk management function in a large organization? Chief Risk Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Risk Management Committee. Now, we've talked about the importance of a Chief Risk Officer. So it makes sense for the Chief Risk Officer to control the risk management function. So this is not the right answer. Chief Financial Officer would not be appropriate. The Chief Financial Officer has a much broader mandate and should focus on his work and should not be responsible for the risk management function. So this is a good answer. The Risk Management Committee actually can be responsible for controlling the risk management function. Remember, the overall high-level policies are defined by the board, and then the interpretation and the management responsibility comes to the Risk Management Committee. So this group is appropriate for controlling the risk management function, therefore not the right answer.